So the first speaker we have today is Professor Lauri Parkkonen from Aalto University, and he'll be talking about decoding attention states from MEG. And I'll let you go. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks, Ben, for putting this event together. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the title as well, which I actually have to decompose because I'm not doing exactly the combination that Ben put in the title, but I'm doing decoding of attention states from MEG data. I'm also doing decoding of MEG for other reasons using convolutional neural networks. So the title is appropriate, but not exactly in that combination. But anyway, so this will give the contents list of my talk today. So first, I'll say just a few words about the imaging tool that we are using, because maybe not all of you are familiar with that, so that you understand the nature of the data to which we are applying these AI tools. So MEG is about measuring brain activity through the magnetic fields that are generated by electrically active neuron populations. So say that if you have an active spot in the brain here, so that will give rise to a potential distribution on the scalp, so voltages that you can measure if you attach a pair of electrodes. So this is, of course, EEG. But then the same currents, they also generate magnetic fields that you can pick up if you have sensitive enough sensors outside of the head. Then if we look at how these signals behave in time, so their dynamics. Now here, in this caricature, you have a hypothetical stimulus. It could be sounds or images that have different durations. So now for the changes, you will have what is known as evoked responses, so transient changes in brain activity that may last from a few tens of milliseconds to some hundreds of milliseconds. Then what we also have are the spontaneous oscillations from the brain that are modulated by stimulus processing and task performance. And now from this kind of an oscillation, we can estimate the amplitude envelope, and then we can identify certain stages. And these kind of signals we can also use in decoding what's happening in the brain using AI tools. But as you can see, the nature of the signals is quite different. There is not just one type of things you will apply the AI tools to, but you may need to convert the data into some more suitable form to extract relevant features for your AI algorithm. All right, but let's go then towards decoding attention-related signals from brain activity. So we've conducted experiments where the subject is listening to two word streams that are presented simultaneously, and the subject here can then just choose which one of the two to attend to. So the physical stimuli are the same all the time, and the only thing that changes is just what the person is attending to. So now, if we do an MEG recording, and what I'm showing here is just the signal from one of the MEG sensors above the auditory cortex in the left hemisphere. And you can see that the attended and also the unattended sounds, so they were just yes and no words, so they produce these clear-cut evoked responses. And there are some changes depending on whether you're attending to the stimuli or not. And now, what we wanted to see is that if we train a machine learning model using these signals, can the model predict which of the word streams the person is attending to? And well, here is still the spatial pattern of the signals, so the hotspots are really above the auditory cortices. Okay, so I don't know which fraction of you are familiar with machine learning tools. I have some of the technical details, but I'm not going to dig into those. So I'm mainly at the sort of superficial level, telling about the approaches rather than details. So we trained a support vector machine using 80% of the data for training it, and then the remaining 20% for testing the model. And this all was done in 2-second windows of the data. So the stimuli were presented every half a second, so they were the responses to 4 consecutive stimuli in each window. And if we do that, the accuracy across our set of 15 subjects is pretty high, 93%. So if you take any 2-second piece of data, so with on average at 93% probability, you can tell what the person is attending to out of these 2 streams. There is, of course, some variation depending on the person, so ranging from 85 to 99%. Okay, so that's pretty good. We can also apply this kind of an algorithm so that we only give to it signals from a certain location of the brain, not everything. And then we can plot the decoding accuracy on the cortical surface. So now the color scale here means that if you extract the signals only from this region, how high is the accuracy of the decoder? And so you can see that you get the highest accuracies around the auditory cortices, which was to be expected. Now this is all pretty good, except that there are 2 problems. First of all, you can't really interpret these models. I mean, you could do this thing that you can apply the decoder in a searchlight fashion to see where the signals are coming from that carry the information about attention. But the model itself, you can't readily translate that into neuroscientific terms. So that's one problem. The other problem is that if you train a model with data from one person and you apply it to the data of another person, it usually doesn't perform too well. You might have above chance level decoding, but it's not very high. And that seems to be the case with most of the conventional classifiers. So then we turned into convolutional neural networks to check if they could do any better than these conventional machine learning approaches. Now the problem with those is that if you have sort of a free CNN type of approach, you typically have millions of parameters to train. And even though we get a lot of samples in MEG and EEG recordings, but it would still be very, very hard to get enough training data to configure this kind of a network. So you need to do something else. And what we came up with is that we try to insert as much prior knowledge into the configuration of the CNN, instead of trying to let the network to learn all these things. And by doing that, so we can reduce the number of parameters that we need to train by several orders of magnitude, having only a couple of thousands of parameters rather than millions. And what is also nice is that the model that comes out of this approach is interpretable. So you can see which, for example, neural sources are contributing to the classification. So this is now the description of the model. Again, if you are not expert in the field, no worries. But I just quickly go through. So it's a fairly shallow CNN. It only has 3 layers. So there's an input layer, which basically just acts as an extraction of the informative spatial patterns of the data. So you could think of that as trying to figure out those spatial projections into the MEG channel set that carry information about distinct sources in the brain. Then after that, we look at the temporal information. So we have a temporal convolution layer, and there are 2 variants of that in this model. One-dimensional convolution, which just deals with the time series of one source at a time, and then also a 2-dimensional one, which looks at the interaction between the estimated source time series. And then the convolutions are followed by the typical rectifying linear unit nonlinearity, and then a max pooling with factor 2. And then as the output, because we are doing classification, so we have an output layer which imposes sparsity using L1 regularization. and then a softmax. So now the great thing about this approach is that we can ask the trained model that why it is able to pick up a certain class. So if you start from the, you sort of use the model in the reverse order. You start from the class output, and then you go back, and you can reach all the layers and have some interpretable information. So I'll just show an example. So here we have applied this kind of a model to a data set where the subject was presented with 5 different sensory stimuli, and then we wanted to classify the brain responses into 5 classes according to the stimulus modality. So now this is what the model comes up with. So you have 2 kinds of visual stimuli, so just stimuli in the left and right visual field. You have somatosensory stimuli, so median nerve stimulation to the left and right wrist, and then auditory stimuli. And now the spatial patterns from this first layer, so you can view them directly as sort of weights on the MEG centers. And you can also convert them into source estimates. So you can tell where the signal is coming from, which is informative for decoding. Then from the temporal convolution layer, you can tell what's the time point which gives the information for decoding. And that's what we have plotted down here. So then how does this perform with respect to other models? So we compared this approach with a couple of other different things. So the 2 lines on the top of the table, so they are this model that I just explained, the 2 variants with the different kind of temporal convolutions. So the validation accuracy is around 95% for this 5-class decoding. Then an SVM, so support vector machine, is doing almost as well. Then the other CNN type of approaches are doing a little bit worse. But then say that what is important that if you go into this, what is here labeled as pseudo-real time, so you take the data only from the beginning of the recording, as if you would be doing a brain-computer interface or something like that, where you have to train with the data from the beginning of the experiment. You can't sort of randomly sample across the recording because you simply just don't have the data available in the beginning when you're doing the training. So there, the CNNs are doing quite a bit better than the other approaches. Right, so then from these observations, I would like to conclude that, first of all, machine learning approaches are a powerful tool in extracting important information from MEG and also from EEG recordings. We can detect direction of selective attention, for example. We can classify motor imagery, things which I didn't talk about that, but that's also one thing that we've been doing. But then with conventional approaches, we have these challenges. There is no good generalization, and it's difficult to interpret the models. And CNN type of approaches answer these questions at least partially by doing this informed structuring of the network. We can do training with a sort of tractable number of samples. We have a fairly high generalization from one subject to the next. And what is important is that the models are interpretable. And I'd just like to end by acknowledging all the collaborators, funding sources, and software packages. And thank you for the attention.
So, do we have any questions for Lauri? Okay. We also have the opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the discussion. Is that a question there with the hand up? The partial hand up?
So how much better is the classification across subjects using the model from one subject?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, so I can repeat it. So how much better is the classification accuracy across subjects when you use CNNs, I think, compared to other? Yeah. Well, that depends a lot on the situation. It also depends on where you're taking the data from. For MEG, it seems to matter a lot because the data are spatially more detailed. So if you go from one subject to the next, so then the drop in the accuracy is usually very large. So you can, if you just use an SVM, for example, so you can go from 90% accuracy in the individual for which you have trained the model down to 60 or something like that. Then with the CNNs, the drop is usually just a few percent. But there is a lot of variation depending on what you are decoding, well, which kind of signals and what's the task. So.
You were talking about MEG, does this hold for fMRI too?
Probably it holds for fMRI too. Yeah, EEG is to some extent easier because the patterns are so blurred to begin with, so that if you have, and also for the fact that there is no problem with the head movement. But in MEG, also in fMRI, if the head is placed differently with respect to the sensors, so then of course the patterns on the sensors are going to be different. And this is one reason why, if you don't compensate for that, so that's one reason why the generalization is not very good. But if you have this kind of a generative model, as we've implemented in the CNN, so then you can take that thing into account. So the model has less to learn to adapt to a new subject, because it's only the pattern has changed a little bit, but it doesn't need to relearn everything.
Does this also hold when you have, let's say, now you had something that is very, very strongly...
Yeah, these are easy things to decode.
Because that causes such a huge signal. So let's say usually if you had a decoding analysis, you will get like a 10% above chance, or maybe 6% above chance. Does this hold for that too? Have you tried any?
Yeah, we have, for example, for motor imagery, then the numbers are lower. We still have an improvement using a CNN with respect to traditional ways of doing classification.
You also there try doing it across subjects, so you
I would say that it's even more prominent in those kind of things than these with very high signal-to-noise ratio.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Lauri.